Hi and welcome to Knit with Hannah. I'm Hannah, I'm a knitting nerd to help you knit with ease, confidence and joy. We are discussing substituting yarn today and which yarns you can use for the knit along, but also which yarns you could use that you might have in your stash for any knit along. I'm going to give you lots of tips today that is relevant to recreate a knit along yarn if you don't and you can't get hold of the original one that's in the pattern. So yes, substituting yarn takes experience. It takes knowing how you knit with the yarns that you do have and that are described for the pattern, because then you know what it is that makes them right, and as soon as you start substituting you'll know what it is that makes them wrong. So I am going to help you just go through that minefield of what's right, what's wrong, what can I use, what can't I use. We're going to go through lots of different things, and I've had some questions already, so I will be answering those questions. Right, so let's get started. We are knitting with Rowan Felted Tweed Aran. So this is an Aran weight yarn. It's thicker than DK, it's thinner than chunky or bulky yarn. So we're definitely going for the middle ground here. We are going for the medium, which is known as a 4 yarn. It's 10 ply. Can be called worsted, but worsted is also very slightly thinner than Aran. So just be aware of that. You could use 4 or 4.5mm needle with worsted, and you'll be not quite in the right zone of gauge if you're knitting with worsted. We're knitting with wool, alpaca and viscose from wood pulp, and yes, I am going to address what if I want to knit with non-animal products. We're also using a 5mm needle, which will give us 16 stitches and 23 rows. This is the one difficult thing when it comes to substituting yarn. I used to think it was so easy, and I'd just substitute a yarn for this and substitute a yarn for that. And changing the needles doesn't always work because, excuse me, you might get the right number of stitches, but the row count would be wrong. And then the row count will be right, but the stitch count will be wrong. So you have to be really careful about how you're knitting and what you are knitting as well. If you have a weight and length of yarn, then you're going to have a very similar heaviness and density to the fibre. But if you have something that's a lot longer, still has the same stitch count, it will be a lot lighter and it will feel a lot looser once you knit it. And if you are knitting with a heavier yarn, then it will feel a lot tighter and denser once you've knitted the fabric. So all of those things can go into substituting a yarn. And if you're wondering what I'm doing here, I have my finger on the pulse of where I was yesterday. Now, yesterday I was at a wool show. This is a wool show in the south of England, in Farnham. Nick and I went there yesterday in very annoying heat, but thankfully the air conditioner in the car is working very well, so we were happily riding along. Went there and I looked at all sorts of different yarns. So I'm going to go through the different yarns, and I will put obviously the videos and the photos on screen when I show you, and I talk about the specific ones. But firstly, let's talk about one that I bought because I thought it would be a really good substitute for this yarn that we're actually knitting with. The substitute for worsted, the Aran Rowan Felted Tweed. Now this is called Woolly. It is made by On My Pebbles in the Netherlands, and it is 100% recycled wool and other materials. So we have recycled wool, polyester, acrylic, nylon, and that means that you are being particularly sustainable. It's upcycling what has been created before. So I really like this idea, and we have different colours here. Now this is something else that I wanted to do. I got you something that's a completely different colourway. It is mustard light pink, dark pink and white. And this means that we have something completely different to the suggested colourways that I have here for you in the Rowan Felted Tweed. But that means that you can see what options are available for you too. You don't have to stick with just the same colourways that I'm using, even if you choose a different yarn. You can go for it. And if you want some tips on picking the colours, I picked those too, because yellow and white, this is a snowy, creamy kind of white. Yellow and white can always go well together. They're very summery. But then I decided to add 2 pinks, because as soon as you add 2 shades of the same colour, then it feels a lot easier. It feels a lot nicer. There was a royal blue and a pale blue as well, as you'll see in the video, that they didn't quite sit as nicely together as these 2 pinks did. So they would have gone okay with the yellow and white, but I think these went a lot better. That's why I picked these. And most importantly, this was the only real yarn that I found that was a decent fit for the gauge. 16 stitches and 22 rows. So the knit along that we are creating with the Rowan Felted Tweed Aran, 16 stitches and 23 rows. So there's 1 row off, but I think it's close enough, and we're knitting small enough pieces. Not only that, we are blocking those pieces as well. So once we've blocked them, we can make them be the size that we want. I think that's very important. If you're knitting something and the gauge is just tiny, then you're blocking it, then it will work. I will knit a single square with this, just to double check, and I will see how it goes. I bought, this is another thing, you are going to need enough yarn. So I have bought 2 of each colour, because this is 100 grams, which gives me the right length, exactly the right length, plus a lot more, because we're using 3 balls of each colour for the felted tweed, and they are 50 grams. With the 100 grams, ideally I would get 3 50-gram balls, but I'm getting the equivalent of 4 50-gram balls, and that is 2 100-gram balls. Okay. There was a lot of information in that. Do feel, if you want to, that you can go back and look at that. So I talked about the gauge, the fibre, I talked about the length and the weight of the yarn that we needed. So the fibre is very similar, not exactly the same, but very similar to the original yarn. The length is similar, and I've got a lot more. The gauge is almost exactly perfect, and we can switch that out with blocking. And yes, the great colours as well. That can be a real help when you're picking yarn. So the other thing you can do is, of course, go online and look at reviews, or talk to people like we did yesterday. I talked to people. I talked to the manufacturers, the hand dyers, and the people who brought in this yarn to sell, and asked them what they thought of the yarn, what they knitted with it, if they had any patterns so I could check the gauge on them. All that kind of thing can be really helpful. Your stash yarn could ideally be made of things that you've already knitted. So you have that yarn sat there and you've already knitted with it. So that can be really helpful too. Your experience with that yarn, how it looks when it's knitted up, could be ideal for you to say yes or no. Ravelry, Facebook groups, just search for images of the patterns and see what people have knitted with the yarn that you're thinking about already. Before you know it, you'll know whether it could more likely be a yes or more likely be a no. Because if they've knitted blankets with it, if they've knitted large items with cardigans, etc. with it, if they've knitted hats and it looks really fluffy and the fabric is really tight, then it's probably not going to be ideal for you. But all of those things can give you just little tips and little clues to say yes or no. Now, let's just have a look at another one of these that I was looking at. So, I'm just going to show you this one, and it is by Curated Yarn Company. Now this is an Aran yarn. The thickness looks ideal as I was sat there looking at it, because I took a couple of squares with me, so I knew whether or not it was going to work when I looked at every yarn. The thickness of the yarn looked ideal. The fibre looked okay too. However, yes, the colours weren't perfect, but they could have worked. But there was no gauge. Not only that, there was no pattern either. So the Curator yarn, it's a small dyer. They make this yarn and they want people to go away and knit with it. Just make things up for themselves. When you're looking at yarn like this, when it's on a skein, it's one of a kind, there's only very few limited edition skeins available of it, then you do have to just err on the side of caution, because yes, it could be okay, but yes, it may not be okay as well. And to be honest, when you're substituting yarn, more often than not, it's not okay. There's so many Aran yarns out there, and a majority of them will not work. But you will find the ones that do, most definitely. And like I did yesterday, I found one. And I could easily have just gone to a yarn shop and found an Aran yarn. Really does depend on the quality of yarn, the fibre of the yarn that you're looking for as well. So, what else did I find? Ah, yes. Now, this was from Skein Queen. The problem here again was no patterns, no gauge, and the colours. If I was going to buy the larger skeins of this, looking at it, I was going to say, well, the teal, the denim blue, and the two purples would probably have been okay. And also you can see that there are multicoloured yarns available in this yarn. Now, I preferred what was on the higher hooks was the chunky yarn, because while it's still multicoloured, the colour doesn't change quite so much as it does with the Aran. It's not quite so flecky. And I would have chosen a single colourway and done the whole blanket in it, rather than mixing them up, I think. Because when you're using a multicoloured, your eyes can get it overly enthusiastic about finding the different colours. If you give the whole thing that same thing, then your eye can say, okay, that's just the colour. Now I'm going to look at the pattern. It just feels like one of those things where a single multicoloured yarn will be much better than multiple multicoloured yarns. So that's something else to consider as well. Now, can I use chunky or DK yarn instead? This is a question I had in the comments last week. And it's a really great question, because yarn all feels the same, and I'll just grab stuff out of my yarn stash and I'll just feel what it, just feel it when I start knitting it. If you knit with a chunky, you're going to get a much larger blanket. If you knit with a DK, you're going to get much smaller blanket. And you may well not end up with squares. We are knitting squares here. And if you start knitting squares with a completely different ratio of stitches and rows, and not only that, with a thicker and a thinner yarn, then you won't have squares. You'll have rectangles in some way or another. They'll either be flat or wide or thin and tall. So it can be really tough to just kind of figure that out. But also, if you start knitting chunky and DK for the different squares, then they're going to have a small one and a large one, and you won't be able to fit them together in a blanket. Ideally, you use exactly the same yarn for every single square. Like I bought it yesterday, I didn't buy 3 different yarns with different colours. I bought the same yarn, but with the different colours. So You can't predict how much yarn you're going to use either. I really do think it's much better for you to say, I need to look for an Aran. That's what I did yesterday. I could have gone to the Farn and Wool show and gone, hey, I know what. I am going to buy any yarn I feel like buying. But what I did was go along with the view to find some Aran yarn. And there were a few manufacturers, a few dyers, a few people there who had Aran yarn, like I found this one. But there were also a few people who said, oh no, I don't have that. Why would you have that? I sell sock yarn. There are different specialities when it comes to yarn dyeing. In that respect, it's a lot easier for you as well, because then you'll have a lot more experience with the people who are talking about Aran yarn. What if I would like to knit with a non-animal yarn? Okay, great idea if you'd like to do that. I mean, this is ideal, especially if you would rather not knit with wool if you are allergic or the person you're knitting for might be allergic. My dad is actually, he can get a rash if he's wearing something that's wool. And I can too, actually, weirdly, if I wear a wool cardigan and it's only on a t-shirt rather than a full sleeve t-shirt underneath, then I will get itchy arm. It doesn't happen when I'm knitting with it, but I have to wear a layer or two underneath to get a decent cover over there. And the jumpers, if I buy them roll neck for the winter, they have to be something that's very soft, and a lot of the time that could only be a synthetic fibre. It's not ideal, I'd rather not do it, but if you want to buy a cotton jumper for the winter, then it's going to be extremely heavy. This is something you have to note. If you want to knit with cotton, which you could do, this will likely work for you. This is the the Wool and the Gang Shiny Happy Cotton that we knitted with in the past for baby blankets. But if you want to knit with that now, then you're going to have a blanket that's larger than the baby blanket, and that's made up of squares. So the way that you seam it together, the density of the fibre and the way that the fibre moves, it's going to feel a lot more, it's going to lose its shape somewhat. This is something that you have to be very aware of when you're knitting a much larger item with cotton, unless you have a very dense pattern within the stitches, then you will lose the shape of the item that you're knitting. For example, a lot of people will knit crochet jumpers for the summer with lots of holes in them, but it's a very tight knit because you're really scrunching the yarn up as you're knitting each stitch while you're making the holes. So it's holding itself together, and a lot of people will prefer to crochet items for the summer because that will hold the cotton yarn in place a lot more easily. So yes, you could use cotton, but I would suggest mixing it with another fibre. See if you can find maybe a recycled cotton polyester. I found a recycled wool. There are recycled yarns out there, a lot more now. Also an option is to go for something which imitates wool, like hemp. Hemp is a lot more likely to hold its shape than a cotton when it's larger. So that's definitely something you could do. Or indeed go for a synthetic. There are compromises we have to make. Sometimes if you'd rather be someone who uses sustainable yarns, you could find a cotton polyester mix, and you could find something that is much more likely to mimic the wool, and that would be acrylic or polyester rather than a nylon. So all those options are there available. Yes, this is an option. If I come up with anything personally, I only had this question this morning before I was filming. So I will have a look and I will put any options in the comments, and I will also put any options in the email list as well over the next few weeks if I come up with anything for non-animal and non-wool. So the options are out there, but of course you can still get the kit if you want to use this wool for the first time through when you're knitting this. Then go for it. And actually, first time through knitting it will give you a much better idea of how it knits up and what you need to look for in other yarns. So that will give you a good idea too. If you want to get it right and you know that there must be something out there, then look at yarnsub.com. It is great for finding yarn substitutes and ideal substitutes. Ask what others have used in Facebook groups on Ravelry. Look at others' experience on Ravelry projects, like I've already said. All of that won't go amiss at all. You'll have knitters' experience mixed in with your own, and that can be so, so helpful. Go and get the kit if you want it and knit all the way through. Go and find some substitute yarn. Have a rifle through your yarn stash. You never know what you might have, and use the digital access passed into the knit along instead if you like. The link to join the knit along is in the description, and I will leave the video here which talks about everything we're going to knit and all about the knit along, all that you're going to get inside the knit along, and that is down here below. Right, I will see you next week where we are talking more about knitting blankets. So, bye for now. Thank you for joining me here. Happy knitting.